thank you.
All right. Good to go.
Okay. Good morning. This is the convening of Massachusetts Gaming Commission. We're holding this public meeting virtually. I will take our roll call. Good morning, Commissioner O'Brien.
Good morning. I'm here.
Good morning, Commissioner Hill.
Good morning, I'm here.
Good morning, Commissioner Skinner.
Good morning.
Good morning, Commissioner Maynard.
Good morning.
All right, we'll get started. It is our public meeting number 452, and we just completed an agenda setting meeting that was really productive. We thank the team for that. We're going to now turn, we don't have minutes, Commissioner Hill, today. I know we will look forward to some in the next meeting, but we're going to turn to Executive Director Wells. Do you have any updates for today?
Nothing for this meeting yet. You can go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. So we really are focused on some internal work initially. Two commissioner updates, and I'm going to turn right to Commissioner Skinner on the budget review. I know you've worked closely with the finance team in your role as treasurer.
Oh, yes. Okay. Well, so Chief Lennon doesn't need an introduction, but I do want to say that he and the finance team have long proven themselves as responsible fiscal stewards of the commission's operating dollars, and you'll see that responsibility play out not only in the commissioner's budget that we're reviewing today, but the overall commission's budget. So with that, I will turn it over to Chief Lennon and John Scully.
Thank you, and we'd love to take credit for this, but Grace has done the majority of the work as well as pulled together the memo. And Grace, if you want to just kick off on the memo, walk through the discussions, and we have met with all the commissioners on this, given you a brief overview. Just to remind you, last year was the first time we did this in public. This used to be done with the chief administrative officer and then would work with the commissioners, but this is a good process for the commissioners to all talk about things together that's in their budget. And what you'll see is the majority of what's in here is just carried forward from last year with a few items that we moved around or made some small adjustments to. But I will let Grace kick this off because she did do the lion's share of this work, and I would like her to be able to take the credit for it.
Thank you, Derek and John. And it was definitely a team effort, and please feel free to jump in at any point with any clarifications or corrections. So I'll just run through this memo, kind of making any of the major highlights, and I'll pause after each section just in case any commissioners have any comments or would like to make any changes. As Derek mentioned, all the commissioners did have a chance to review this ahead of time, but I know it was a couple of weeks ago now at this point. So just to review, since we brought on sports wagering, there is a slightly different allocation of funds when it comes to salaries, mainly salaries for this budget. So gaming will carry 65%, sports wagering will carry 28.5%, and racing will carry 6.5%. And that is, again, mainly for salaries. So then on to salaries. The salaries in this budget includes the 5 commissioners' salaries, the executive assistant salary, which is new from last year, and the CAO to the chair's salary, which is mine. Moving on to parking and meeting space. So you're all aware, all 5 commissioners have parking here at 101 Federal Street. Parking for next year is going up slightly, which you will see noted. Same as in the years past, we have funding reserved for off-site meeting space. So this money could be used for space rentals, AV needs, catering, or anything related to hosting meetings, public meetings, or hearings at off-site locations across the Commonwealth. And I know there's been some interest in doing this, and we have done this in the past as well. So we're reserving some funds for that. In addition, we've added a new line item for commissioner-sponsored team building events. So this would be anytime the commissioners wanted to host a training or a team building or anything with the team. All right. Continuing down to general consulting. In the past, there's been a line item for transcription services. Legal now has their own transcription service for meeting minutes, so we have reallocated those funds for general consulting purposes, in case anything comes up over the year that you all would like to hire an outside consultant for. So down to travel and conferences. So I know there was a lot of interest in traveling in last fiscal year. That might have been pulled back a little bit with the onset of sports wagering and how many meetings you all had at the end of last year. And I know a lot of you have expressed interest in traveling more in FY24. So the travel expenses for next year have been level funded from last year. And this number was put together by an estimate of about $3,000 per conference, and that would include conference fees and registrations, hotel travel, and reimbursements, assuming each commissioner goes on about 3 conferences a year. That would allow for about $8,500 per commissioner for the travel budget for the year. Are there any questions, comments on that?
Yeah, I do think that we as a body of 5 just need to talk about that number in terms of, I asked this last year, and I'm assuming because the number is static, the answer to this first question is yes, but whether, I know cost of travel has gone up, and so whether 3,000 per is still reasonable, or whether there should be kind of in New England, outside New England, is there a delta there? Because it seems to me like airfare, hotel might add more to that than just an across the board 3,000 per commissioner. But I guess that's a question for you guys who know the numbers better than we do. And then the second is really whether we're doing this. The conversation we had last year, my presumption was that number came out as a ×5. And so we all kind of had this default of 20% of that total number. Seems like there might've been not unanimity on that. So I do throw that out as something I think we need to talk about also.
So I think on
The
first-
overall budget, Commissioner Byrne, if you could just elaborate what you mean.
So if I'm not mistaken, is this 3,000 per commissioner per conference? That was the same number for the calculation last year, right? And I know we had some conversation about how cost of travel was at that point going up. And we didn't know if that was going to be a reasonable number as a placeholder. I'm assuming, because it's still there, that you guys feel like based on last year, that's still a reasonable placeholder. But my question is also 3,000 per commissioner per conference. There's different ways to do it. You know, like the only one I've been to really is I drove up to Portland, right? So there was no airfare, like 2 nights, whatever, which to me is very different than going to one that's airfare, extended hotel, et cetera. And is there going to be, it would seem to me that if you're going to a bunch that don't have any sort of airfare or hotel, is that different than going to ones that have airfare and hotel? You know what I mean? Like, because 3,000 for those where there's airfare and hotel seems low to me, but I could be completely off on that. So that was my sort of numbers question on the 3,000.
And what was the 20%? That was my question.
Oh, there's 5 of us. And so this is based on three per year, blah, blah, blah. And so ×5 got us to the number at the top. And so I had assumed that that was sort of that amount, everyone was going to take their tranche of 20% of that. I don't know that that was everyone's perception, but that was my perception when we talked about it last year.
Commissioners?
I can answer the first question. And John's here as well, and Grace has reviewed the numbers. The 3,000 is still holding good per trip. That's actually on the high side, especially if you're going for a typical 2 to 3 day trip. Now, if you're going international, that's a whole nother issue where that's going to be a little more expensive. But for domestic, the 3,000 is holding. And you know, like we said last year, this is just for an estimate to put in there. Obviously, there's in-state or local travel that's a lot cheaper. So we had just put this aside and as I've said in the past, if we exceed this, which we are only at about 50%, we're under 50% spent right now through the this period in the fiscal year. But if we exceed it, that's an area where we could go back and find additional money, because at 3,000 a trip, that's not big when you're talking about a $35 million budget. So this is purely for budgeting purposes. But the second piece is more of a policy discussion, which we would leave up
Right.
to the commission.
Right.
But the 3,000 is holding well this year, which
Right.
we're pleased to see.
Yeah, okay.
And so the 20% is what you were saying, Grace, is the 8,500, correct?
Correct, that would be 8,500.
Okay.
Derek, if I can just add, when you say we're at 50%, we're at 50% because we had to do sports wagering, and a lot of us decided not to go forward with things we probably should have gone to. So I think it's a little misleading, not by you, just the number itself at 50%, because that number I think would have been a lot higher had we not been doing sports wagering this year. Is that an accurate
Correct.
statement?
Yes, that's a very accurate statement. I think you will see that a lot of travel dropped off between the months of September and February and into March, based on the calendars being full with sports wagering agenda items. I think that it's very important as a regulatory body, and I've said this many times, that you get out and stay up to date on what other jurisdictions are doing, what the trend is. It's the same thing I used to see in insurance, banking, and telecommunications, which are all very heavily regulated industries. So I think it's very important, especially for the commission who's setting the policy, to be out attending these. You are correct that 50% at this point is, I think, very indicative of the sports wagering that was on our agenda for this year.
I can say as one commissioner that I would like to have probably attended a couple of these conferences, and I think would have educated me in helping me be a better regulator as we were doing sports wagering. But I chose not to do that. And I feel a little bit that maybe I made a mistake not going to one or two of those. But moving forward, I may think very differently.
So do you feel like that number is too low, Commissioner Hill? I mean.
No, I think we're right where we need to be, and we can reassess if we need to in the future. But I just want to make clear why the 50% is 50%.
Commissioner Maynard, Commissioner Skinner? Want to weigh in? Commissioner Skinner, what are your thoughts?
No, I think Derek had it right. We have a budget, a travel budget, and, if that needs to be adjusted later in the fiscal year, we can always come back to have that discussion. I said at the beginning of this discussion, I highlighted the fiscal responsibility of the finance team, but as commissioners, we are all fiscally responsible, and I do trust that we are all working within the budget when we're making decisions to travel, and when we're getting those requests approved by our appointing authorities.
The requests are that the funds are available. That's what I want to make sure, that we're not pinning on the appointing officials anything around our travel plans, because we do have to submit, but if I understand correctly, Derek, you send verification that funds are available, and that's what they're certifying to. And then to the extent we accept, for instance, if we're speaking and we accept some things waived, we do then have to make disclosures to our appointing officials to be allowed under the ethics rules to accept that. So there are different processes, Commissioner Skinner, with respect to our appointing officials, but I think that the certification is really about funds available, and I think what I'm understanding is that we're looking at the bottom line number of how much for travel.
42.5.
42.5 total.
42.5.
$42,500 for a total travel budget for all 5 commissioners.
Is that for out of state or is that for?
That is
That's all.
all travel line items combined. So that would be out of state travel, conference fees, and things like in-state mileage and reimbursements.
And that's what we spent this year.
That's what we budgeted this year.
I know I'm having such trouble hearing, guys. I am so sorry. It's both the acoustics behind me, the fan, and then my microphone. I thought for some reason, Grace, I'm seeing, and I might not be reading this correctly, 81,370 is the travel.
No, that I believe is for the object class E for administrative expenses. Travel is part of that.
Yes, so Grace broke this out nicely in the memo. BO1.
Yeah, okay, I'm looking at
E30,
the graph. I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
Yes.
BO1, E30, E41, and EE2 are all of our combined travel lines, because you have out-of-pocket reimbursements, which could be mileage, whether it's in-state or out-of-state. If you are making your own hotel reservations and paying those, then you'll ask for reimbursement. And then when you're on a trip and you pay for any food, that will come out of those out-of-pocket reimbursements as well. And then when we align and pay for the hotels or the conference fees and the flight, that comes out of either the credit card line, the registration line, or the travel agent line. So it depends on what arrangements we can work with and cannot work with. Some conference sites will actually let us bill them. Some say, no way, you pay us up front with a credit card. Sometimes a travel agent will pay for it if it's only one person traveling and ask for reimbursement. And if we have multiple people traveling, they said they can't lay out that cash, so then we have to pay for it up front through the credit card. So that's why it's split between all those different object classes and object codes, because it can hit against any single one of those. And we look at all of those as interchangeable to that 42,500 number.
So when Derek sends over a certification to an appointing official verifying that the funds are available, you're looking for whatever is available in the 42,500 as opposed to any, and I think your point is 20% allocation. I think we want to be clear on that. And if everyone's comfortable, that is, I think, Derek, how you look at the funds, if they're available.
Correct. That is how I look at it. And that's generally how I do it across each division as well. I'll take a look at what's remaining, take a look at the TAF of what the estimates are, and get back to a division head or a budget manager within that division and say, hey, either you need to move some money around, or yeah, it looks good, go ahead and travel. And as the next one comes up, you'll have to keep an eye on it.
So I'll tell you my personal view. I have no problem with Derek doing that. I think it would be a good courtesy to all of us as individual commissioners to kind of maybe plan our traveling, especially if I'm hearing, Commissioner Hill, that you didn't, that the money's reflected, our balance now may not reflect what will happen next year. Is think about how the allocations are going, because a couple of us spend more upfront, it might mean less for another commissioner. And that's all. So some kind of a thinking, I don't know if we need to formalize that, but I do think if there's going to be a pattern where people want to get to conferences, and Derek, you're quite right, it's important for learning. There's also if people are asked to speak, there are associated costs to that speaking engagements don't cover all costs, and we want to be able to make sure that if the gaming commission is asked to be represented, that we have that. And so I guess that there just should be some kind of we can't talk among ourselves about this, so there should just be some kind of coordination, perhaps, for general awareness. Does that seem reasonable, everyone?
I think it does. That's exactly the way, these conversations should be had. When I decide to travel, for one, my first question is, what other commissioners are going, right? And then I sort of make my decision whether or not to attend a conference based around that. I think that, as you stated, it's a simple professional courtesy. If funds are not depleted, but if, one commissioner, for instance, is sort of utilizing more from the pot in that particular line item, I think that, if there's another expense that needs to be covered, I think it's just as simple as a discussion. And I think we can get there without sort of this allocation of the 20% per commissioner. The way that this budget has been managed thus far, I don't see a reason to depart from that. And I understand that the way the budget's been managed before is, we have the ceiling, at the time the budget is voted on. But if there are funds that need to be reallocated to any line, not just travel, we have the ability to do that. And I just want to make sure that we are not losing sight of that.
Well, so if I could be clear also, the reason the representation that in the past it's been done as sort of one pot, et cetera, I have always gone forward under the assumption that each commissioner's portion of that is 20% of the total. And that if there was anything that was going to go over that person's 20%, we would come back and have a conversation to avoid a circumstance where you're putting staff in a position where there might not be, or they might not be able to certify to an appointing authority there is the respective money in the account. So part of the reason I started with that is I thought that was the fundamental agreement among the four of us that were here last year. I don't think it was. So I don't think it needs to be a formal vote, but I do think that there should be some sort of clear trigger point for staff where if a request is going to go over that 20% for any one of the five of us, it does say you got to go back and have a conversation amongst the five to move the monies around. My question in that regard, in addition to how does everyone else feel, is particularly given the fact that several of the commissioners, according to the memo, and then even Commissioner Hill's statement today, intend to do more travel next year. Should we be preemptively budgeting a little bit more than 42.5 if, we already have some commissioners indicating, I want to go out and do sports wagering and I want to do more travel than last year. So I do think there should be a thing, if any one of us is going in and putting in a request that would go over 20% of this allocation, it has to come back to a conversation amongst the five of us. And then the other question is, knowing we have more travel anticipated this year, is that 42.5 too low?
Commissioner Skinner?
So I don't want this to be a discussion between Commissioner O'Brien and I. I think I've been clear both in these public meetings and individual discussions that I've had with staff. I don't think that we should be allocating a dollar amount to commissioner travel. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think that any other division operates that way. And I don't see a reason for the commissioner to be maintaining and maintaining its budget in that way. I just, it's not lost on me that I've traveled, and it kind of just feels like, this is, sort of an approach to me personally, and I have to put that out there. I think that we are all professionals. We are all public employees. We all, understand what a budget is. And so, to think that either one of us, is not willing to step back and take a look at what is available in the account and go from there and make adjustments accordingly, I think it's I think it's presumptive, and I think it's a lot of to do about nothing. I think it's a lot of ado about nothing. And that's where I sit. I understand that every commissioner intends to travel. That's fine, and I encourage that. As Commissioner just said, Commissioner Hill just said, everyone should travel. As long as there is a legitimate business purpose for it. So, to have this cap on commissioner travel, I just think it's unnecessary, especially when we are all independent. And I raised this issue earlier. We are, seeking out the approval to travel by our appointing authority, out of state, that is. And, again, with the understanding that what finance is signing off on is the availability of funds, as long as there are funds available, as long as funds can be made available, and the appointing authority is approving that travel, and that's according to statute. I don't think it's the case for any one of the 5 of us to intervene in that. If it's a matter of increasing the budget line, I think we need to have that discussion now. But no other commission budget, no other division budget operates in this way. And I'm at a loss, honestly, to understand why there is a feeling that the commissioners need to operate in this manner.
Commissioners, you want to weigh in? Commissioner Maynard, are you off the microphone? Or Commissioner
No,
Bryan?
I'm happy to. I wasn't here during this last conversation. I'll say that's a benefit, maybe. I have a benefit of not being here during this last conversation, but I was here during most of the fiscal year. Came August 1st. I've traveled in state to the properties, right? But I've not been to a conference, and to Commissioner Hill's point, a lot of it had to do with sports wagering. It also had to do with my transition as a commissioner, right? It takes me a little bit more homework to come up to my colleagues, and I respect that. Hope they respect it too. But I think if I'm being asked, I see we're public servants, and I think that we do owe a duty to the Commonwealth, both to be informed regulators and to get as much knowledge as we can, but to also be really, really good stewards. And I agree with Commissioner Skinner. I don't think there's anybody on this commission that's not a good steward. I'm a big budget person, right? I personally budget myself. I believe if you don't set a goal, you're never going to hit it. I would stick with that 20% number. That's just me. That way I know where I am and where I'm not. And I don't want to put staff in a difficult position of having to try to make decisions that the commission has decided or may decide. I'm going to get to my first conference next fiscal year because I was asked to speak at Nickel G's, and I'm happy to attend and very grateful for the invitation. But I would keep a 20%. Commissioner O'Brien, I asked the same question you asked to Derek, and he reassured me that this can be brought back up if the cap starts hitting, right? Like, so if it's not enough when we start to see that, we can bring it back. And so that comforts me. So I wouldn't raise the cap today. I would be open to it if we get to a point, say next early spring, and we see that the caps aren't working, but that's kind of where I am.
Commissioner Bryan? Or Commissioner Hill?
Folks, yeah, so just to make a point of it too, is the position I'm taking today is the same position that I took a year ago. And it is not personal to any particular commissioner. It is my concept of being responsible with the dollars on the budget. And I'm also being mindful of the fact that to get those out of state approval from our appointing authorities, there has to be confirmation that money is available. There may be a circumstance, if we don't say 2020, where staff has to make a judgment call should I go over to this, which may mean there's not enough for everybody else? At what point do they have to say, we have to stop and go back? I think it should be when you hit that marker. Otherwise, if we're not going to do that, it's got to be some other marker shy of 20 per. Okay, when we have encumbered 80% of that, this has to come back to the 5 of us, because I don't want to put staff in a circumstance of saying, I can't do both, and delaying someone's travel, because you can't go until you get the approval. So my solution would be simply equitable, 20% cap, talk about it. You may not need to, or we may say we need to increase the entire thing. If that's not going to be the case, my recommendation is there's some recommendation of we hit 75, 80% of whatever that is. And then we have to come back and talk about raising that allocation to make sure that staff is not put in that circumstance.
Commissioner O'Brien, my only problem with that is that no other line item it works that way. No other budget within the commission works
But
that way.
respectfully, Commissioner Skinner, no other part of this requires our staff to make an attribution on the budget that then triggers to an outside agency. That's what I'm trying to avoid, is any circumstance where there's anything on staff connected with our travel that makes them make decisions about allocating what's left in the budget. So to me, it's either 20% per, or we agree to some other threshold amount that at that point it comes back and we feel like we 5 are going to say, you know what, it's going from 42.5 to 60, because there's just a lot we need to get to this year. And I don't want to put staff in the circumstance of having to either choose between a commissioner, because there isn't enough to approve both and get out to appointing authorities in time for a trip. So as a practical matter, it's either 20% per or some other trigger.
So I think that this would be a good time, Madam Chair, if you would indulge, to hear from staff, to hear from our CFO, because that I don't think that
Respectfully,
staff is ever in that
this is a
position.
policy choice.
One minute. I'm sorry. This is a really important conversation. I want to turn to Commissioner Hill. He's next. Commissioner Hill.
So here's what I'm juggling with, and I heard this at the beginning of the conversation, and I think it was you, Madam Chair, who commented on this. I agree that there should be a threshold. Once we hit a threshold, we're getting close to it. We need to come back. We need to reassess. And no, I'm saying that, and then I'm going to say what your comment was. We absolutely, when we get to a certain point of spending, should come back if we're getting to a point as a commission. I mean, that's just, to me, common sense. However, Madam Chair, what you said earlier made me think about something. So let's say that we all agree that we get $3,000, whatever the number is. Madam Chair, and I'm going to go to Commissioner Maynard, using your 2 examples, you have been invited to something that is not necessarily a conference you would have went to, but you were invited to speak at a round table or something. Well, that kind of throws a little problem into the $3,000 that you would have been allocated for, because now you're going and doing something and spending more than you would have because of an invite, not a conference that you would have attended normally. So that's what I'm juggling.
And I appreciate that, and I pointed out because I recently was. It was a real, very, very kind and thoughtful invitation, and I went and I did pick up the expenses myself because of our budgeting issue. And I know that that's on me and my husband, and he's very patient and, less shoes, but took care of that obligation. But not everybody can do that. I guess I'm just saying, speaking engagements are not necessarily covered in total. With that said, Commissioner Hill, we should take into consideration, but I also have to say that I'll weigh in now. I've worked in state government an awful long time, and I take the issue of being a fiduciary to state dollars very seriously. And so I would not suggest that we expand the budget right now. When it comes to speaking engagements, perhaps we should think about that being a different line item. But for travel and conferences, I would not suggest that we expand. I think $8,500 per commissioner is a lot. It's a lot of money. And there are times where a conference, I remember the first time I came here, my colleague, Commissioner Cameron, said, don't attend that one, it's too flashy. You'll be able to do better, spend less for something. And I appreciated that. And probably she knew my sensibilities. She was giving me some guidance, and it turned out we really didn't end up traveling at all, Commissioner O'Brien and I, with respect to COVID. But, we could attend things virtually. But my sensibilities are to be very frugal. I would not recommend today expanding, even if there's this notion of higher costs, given that even with the 50%, left, I would say that's a high number. And I think about all the other state employees across the Commonwealth who also would benefit by travel. As I know that we are regulators, but there's opportunities for virtual training. There's opportunities for roundtables. I would say stick to that. And I like the idea of all of us. I really commend Commissioner Maynard for suggesting that, he sticks to a budget because you do it personally. I extend that out to myself. So my thinking is whether or not we formalize it or not, it was consistent with what I said last year to Commissioner O'Brien, that in my mind, I would only think about the 20% share. But if I had approached and needed to go over, I would feel comfortable coming back to my fellow commissioners and say, look, I'm in this situation. And I think where there may be funds available, we probably would say, if it all made really good sense for the Commonwealth, well, let's fund this Delta. But I'm going with my long-standing instinct on these are critically important state dollars, and I'm going to be frugal. That's my recommendation. To stick with the number it is, and whether it's formalized or not, that we all think about that allocation. And Commissioner Skinner, I do hear you. And I will say, I just think as a steward of state funds, I think about that. I also do believe Commissioner O'Brien, you've raised a really good point, for staff in terms of how they are going to legitimately be able to project. Because at some point, what if all 5 decide to go to the full 8,500? When can Derek sign off to our appointing officials? He has to make a lot of assumptions at a certain point, maybe. And I don't know if that makes sense. So maybe it just makes sense for us to have that practical number and understand that certain circumstances, commissioners may exceed it, and we'll just revisit it, and we're all good colleagues to each other. And we say, Commissioner Hill, we want you to go to that horse racing conference that you haven't gotten to, and it does put you over that 8,500, but we'll revisit. I just think we have that flexibility. So that's just my thoughts. Commissioner Skinner?
Thank you. So I think this discussion is based on a lot of assumptions and misunderstandings. I think that, Chair, you talked about covering the cost of your travel to a conference based on a budgeting issue. I don't know what you were referring to.
No, that was just, no, it wasn't a budgeting issue. That was me and my decision. But I realized at that point, conference costs, if you're speaking, it doesn't always get, or you're asked to speak, it doesn't always, there's no necessarily a way to get reimbursed, Commissioner Skinner.
Okay,
That's all. There wasn't any misunderstanding.
Thank you
But
for
I
that
pointed it out.
clarification. Yep, thank you for that clarification, but it's not my understanding that there is a budgeting issue within the commission, not for travel or for any other line. Secondly, I'm not advocating to increase the travel line budget beyond what it is today. The recommendation from our finance team was 42.5 to level fund it from last year. I'm okay with that. But what I'm not okay with is some of the assumptions that have been made and this reference to staff being put in a situation where they're going to have to make judgment calls, around which commissioner travel to certify. And so to the extent that, a decision is being made with that in mind, I would like to hear from CFO Lennon so that, we can all be on the same page as to what the finance process entails, not just with respect to travel when we're up against hitting the budget, right? But any other line. And, if we're talking about a 20% allocation, I think we need to expand that beyond just the travel line. We've got a consulting dollar amount that has been added, for morale boosting events and the like. If all 5 commissioners want to host something for staff, we're up against that same issue. So this should not be limited to a discussion around travel and advocating dollars per commissioner. It should be across the board. It should be, widespread. Travel shouldn't be isolated. So with that, I'm going to ask that Derek weigh in terms of what the process is that finance undertakes when a given line item is getting close to the budget.
Ooh. So to address that issue there are a few items. We meet with each division on a monthly basis, and Grace has been going on behalf of the commissioners. Crystal used to go, and we review where everything is as far as spending. And a budget is just that, right? It's an estimate. And then as you get into actuals, you have things that shape your decision making. Now, where it's a little different with the commissioners is there's a division head of each division where you're all appointed either by 1 or 3 officials. So you have different heads there, right? And different appointing authorities. So we look at a budget as it's an estimate for the year. As long as you're not exceeding your total division's budget, we let you move stuff around. Now, if you look at the commissioner's budget this year, and we did review some of it, we haven't spent hardly any of the money to go out to public meetings. So there's another 30,000 sitting there that's available. We haven't spent the interpreters. So there's 10,000 there on top of the 20,000 that is sitting available for travel. So if there were an issue, we would say to the budget manager of another division, hey, you've got some free money here. What are your plans for meetings offsite, or what are your plans for a consultant? And if the travel is a bigger priority, let's move some money around internally in your budget to meet that. If you were fully maxed out, we would say, hey, we have money available. I would go to Karen and I'd say, hey, Karen, there's this priority that's come up. We have money available in an spending in another division. Is it okay to move money around internally there? So we're tracking this monthly. We try not to come back to you for an increase in assessment. We try to say, here's the priority of the day. Let's take down another priority, something that is less prioritized or is underspending, and move the money there. Otherwise, we'd be coming back to you every quarter with an increase to the budget versus just managing those internally. So that's how we handle it with every other division. I can concede that there's a little difference here, or a large difference with the commissioners. So however you determine to prioritize that, what I would suggest is you let someone, maybe it's Grace, like Crystal was doing before, or Janice was doing before that, kind of work with all of you internally to say, hey, here's some pressures that are coming up. Do we need to take this back to a meeting? Or can we just adjust internally since we think there's some underspending here? And that will avoid a lot of these issues of bringing it back every time there is something that's hitting a certain threshold when you've got underspending in 20 other areas. That's just my suggestion, but whatever you choose to do, if you want to set a threshold, if you want to set a amount per person, we can work on that. I mean, each division sets their own standards, and the decision ultimately comes from the division head of those divisions. But with the commissioners, it's all a little different. So I hope that wasn't too much of a circular answer, but we are willing to implement whatever you say. But I think there is a mechanism for you to manage that internally without it having to come back to a commission meeting each time. And that would be to utilize Grace.
Thanks, Derek. And the last point I want to make is, there's an assumption that Commissioner O'Brien, you mentioned this, Chair, you mentioned this, is that you feel the same way today as you felt last year. We didn't talk about this in depth last year in terms of assigning an allocation per commissioner. The same thing that we are doing today in terms of arriving at a budget. There was a recommendation by our finance team, and that recommendation, yes, was based on 3 trips per year at $3,000, give or take, per trip. But it wasn't set in stone. There was no consensus that what we were going to impose as a policy going forward was that each commissioner was limited to 3 trips per year. So I want to make that clear. You may have been under that impression, Commissioner O'Brien, but I certainly was not.
No, as I said, that was my understanding of the math. Like you, I went back and watched the meeting again. That was in fact my understanding. And I feel the same way today. And I do feel that this is uniquely singular expense, unlike team building and anything else that's in the commissioner's budget. And we are a unique division.
Did I
And then-
freeze? Did Commissioner O'Brien freeze or did I freeze?
I think we froze.
It was me?
No, I think it was Commissioner O'Brien because I was
Okay.
waited with bated breath to hear what she said.
Am I speaking now or am I still frozen?
No, you're good.
Just speaking now.
So for me, and Derek, I have an understanding and appreciate everything that you're saying. Because of the interplay of having to give a certification to an outside agency and to not impede anyone's travel, and so we're all on the same page, I do feel like when it comes to this, there should be a trigger point of coming back and saying, commissioners, we want to flag this for you. And if it's Grace tracking, that's fine with me. You might want to revisit this. You might want to move it over from this. You haven't used consultants the way you did during sports wagering, et cetera. And then we all come together and say, fine. But, I haven't changed where I came on it last year. But if it's not a 20% per, I do think there should be a triggering point of that conversation of where you're going to move the money around from to make sure that any attestation that needs to go out, that money is there, is not put on staff to make a judgment call about moving money from our part, because we are the 5 directors of this group. Unlike every other division you're talking about, one individual is vested with that authority.
Right.
And I didn't freeze again, I'm done.
No, okay. Commissioner Maynard?
I just want to say that I was not here, but I agree with the direction that Commissioner O'Brien just laid out. And I think that, for me, I can't move on the fact that there should be a number assigned. The number should be equitable. A couple of us do have multiple appointing authorities, so alerting them's not as easy as having one. And so that's always in my mind. And I think that's how I come down on this, is that I think that we should have a limit. And to be completely frank, if I go over that number, I do not think it's fair to take from another commissioner without having a conversation with the full commission about it. And I'm perfectly okay with that having that conversation if I get to a point where I need to go to something where I would need those funds reallocated, especially having all three appointing authorities, right, where there may have to be some explanation involved.
Okay. I think it probably makes sense that we have a vote on our budget. I'm not sure we formalized it with a vote last year, and it's really important for the team to understand the commission's decision, so that they will have guidance going forward, clear guidance, and not have to make independent judgments or assessments on that. So I don't know if we have other questions about, we'll just park the travel discussion for now. Call that question for now. Were there other items in our budget that you wish to discuss before we were to decide to adopt this budget?
I think Grace has to get through the rest of the memo.
Yes, I know.
On my end, the last few items here under additional items are really more just housekeeping, level funding for printing supplies and office furnishings. The fringe benefit cost has percentage has increased. And just to note that in FY23 there was a large line item for consulting from EY, which will not be in this year's budget. So there was a decrease in the total budget. And that kind of rounds out all the items for discussion on the budget.
In terms of process, Derek, this budget does go before the operators, correct? As part of the overall budget.
Correct. We are meeting with the operators on the 15th to review our recommendations, and then we will bring those recommendations from the operators back to the commission on the 1st. So this will be one of the pieces with every other division that's discussed with the operators,
Okay.
of which we have grown substantially this year. It used to be a meeting of just 3 operators, so now we have quite a few sitting at the table this year.
Any other, Commissioner Hill, are you?
Madam Chair,
Okay.
I'm waiting patiently to make a motion.
Okay. Any further discussion before there's a motion? Okay. Commissioner Hill.
Madam Chair, I move that the commission approve the FY24 Commissioner's budget as included in the Commissioner's packet and discussed here today.
Second.
Did I hear a second?
Yes.
I do need some clarification because I don't want this to not be clear. Does this mean that we are adopting 20% breakdown or not?
So, I mean, I had posited that or a threshold of 75% where they would come back and have conversations about reallocating what was left in the budget. I'm comfortable with either of those.
As am I. I'm not sure we need to vote on it. I think the staff has heard us.
We absolutely must vote on this, Commissioner Hill, because this is where I think, I learned just through working with Karen that there was ambiguity on what the commission wanted. I think Commissioner Skinner, you alluded to that ambiguity. So I think probably to help our staff understand, we should probably be clear that with respect to the budget laid out, I'm not sure, I don't want to speak for it because I want to hear from the commissioners as to, I'm not sure about the 75% that you just said, Commissioner O'Brien. So you lost me on that. I need to have some clarification as to the travel so that,
So
that
Madam Chair,
our CFO is clear for certification purposes.
so I think process-wise, I would like to withdraw my motion at this time because I believe we should probably vote on that separately. And then once we have that vote, we would then make a motion for the full budget. That's how I would like to move forward. So at this time, I'd like to withdraw my motion.
Okay. That's allowed, right?
Do you need a second or?
I got a nod from Todd, so we're good. And I asked this only because there were many questions raised, and I'm not saying I have necessarily, I've expressed my opinion that I just think a threshold is helpful for guidance for us as commissioners and then
Understood.
colleagues. But I don't know if I understood Commissioner O'Brien's alternative. And I think I understand Commissioner Skinner's, idea that just one global budget.
Well, let me, just
Okay, go
based
ahead.
on the two options that Commissioner O'Brien just put forward, I support the latter. And that being the 75%.
And could we go over that, please?
So just so we're clear, so my preference is the 20% per, but I say this, and everyone else can comment in addition to Commissioner Skinner. If that's not workable, then hitting a threshold of be it 75% or something where we have to have other conversations to come back and say, this is where we are and we're going to need to, where do we want to pull the money from? Right? Do we want to say we haven't used consultants? Do we want to say we haven't done team building, et cetera? Then we have to come back in at that point. Or is it a 20% per? And if any individual goes over, you come back in. So that's why I was saying the 75% would mean not necessarily coming back if someone went over the presumptive 20%, but if we as a 5 have now consumed 75% or close to it of the budget, we'd have to come back. And the 5 of us have to have a conversation about where are we going to move the money around in this budget.
Commissioner Maynard.
Can I ask a clarifying question, Commissioner O'Brien? Hypothetically, if I went on a trip that spent 75% of the budget, now that would be a really good trip. But let's say I did. It would be possible for under this scheme, technically, I'm not saying realistically,
Fair point.
to then trigger.
Right.
That's why I'm a little more comfortable with your first position, which is the
Right.
20%.
I am as well. I was throwing that out there because I know Commissioner Skinner is not as comfortable with that. So it was sort of an alternative. I'm more comfortable with the 20 per, but the 75 was sort of another way in my mind of making sure that we were having the conversation to reallocate if we needed to.
Commissioner Hill, your thoughts on this?
No, I'm going back to where I was last year. I think 20% of the total cost for each one. If we get close or go over, we come back and have a discussion. I'm okay with that.
I'm comfortable with that. And honestly, I guess I'm just terribly frugal, but I'm not as comfortable just assuming our budget has, just because we didn't spend down on a certain line item that is they're fungible, that they come over to travel. I think they're savings for the Commonwealth and for the operators. I just don't see those as being as fungible as, I appreciate Chief Commissioner Lennon, Chief Lennon's, he does sometimes have to do that for the operations of our agency. I feel that some of our expenses are more discretionary, and travel is one of those. So I don't see the funds as being as flexible, but I appreciate that they could be. And so we could revisit if, as we said, if things just work out that we really do need to, increase our travel budget down the road, we would come back transparently with the Commonwealth and explain why. And so that's why I think having 20% allocation is advisable at this time. So to vote on that separately, is that how you're thinking, Commissioner Hill?
That's what I would like to do, and then we can take a full vote on a vote on the full budget after that. That's my way of thinking, but of course, If everybody else thinks differently, so be it.
Commissioner O'Brien, your thoughts?
That's fine. I mean, I think Commissioner Skinner, if we vote separately, it allows her voice to be recorded so that she can make clear her preferences. And then a separate vote on sort of the overall broad stroke budget. I think there's probably more unanimity on that, so.
Commissioner Skinner, are you okay with that?
I'm okay with that.
Okay, excellent. All righty. Commissioner Hill, got a motion for us.
I actually did not have a motion for this one since it was put forth by a fellow commissioner. I thought she was going to do it.
Okay,
I certainly, just before I do it, Grace and Derek, can I confirm that that would be in reference to items B1, E30, E41, and EE2 that we'd be talking about? I don't want to over-reference. That's correct?
Yeah, that's correct. It's the BO1, E30, E41, and EE2. That's exactly correct.
Okay.
and can I just clarify that there's a two-pronged process here that when we travel, we have to, out of state only, we do have to show that there are sufficient funds. And then for reimbursements, I have to sign off on reimbursements for the commissioners, and then the treasurer and Commissioner Skinner signs off on my reimbursements. That's just a reminder. And then we have to go through that. The ethics analysis, should we be accepting any waiver of fees, associated costs, and that we go through our appointing officials. Todd, is there anything else, or Derek, on the whole? That's a high level view, but that's kind of the steps that are taken.
Yes, and we review your expenses for your out-of-pocket reimbursements associated with the TAF to make sure that they're not off by more than 20% from what the estimate was. Because we do know that GSA rates change at times. We do know that sometimes you cannot get a hotel at the GSA rate, especially if it's a high conference. We know that travel costs can change if trips change. So we do review that. And if those need to be adjusted, we send those back to the appointing authority as well. Before we do the final approval and push those through to be reimbursed through payroll.
I didn't appreciate that. That's really helpful, Derek. Thank you. Appreciate it very much. Okay, anything else on just the process for travel? Okay, and a big thanks to Trudy, who takes good care of us on all of that good work. So thank you. All right. So Commissioner O'Brien, are you ready then? Unless Commissioner Skinner, you want to make a motion? Anybody wants to make a motion on it?
Madam Chair, I can make a motion. I move that the commission direct the budget office and CFO to come back to the commission in the event that any individual commissioner exceeds 20% of the allocated amount for the cumulative total of BO1, E30, E41, and EE2 for further discussion by the commission of reallocations to address any issues.
Second.
Any further discussion on this? All right. Commissioner O'Brien?
Aye.
Commissioner Hill?
Aye.
Commissioner Skinner? I couldn't quite hear you.
There's nay.
Nay, or abstain? I want to just clarify.
I said nay. Madam
Okay,
Chair.
thank you. And Commissioner Maynard?
Aye.
And I vote yes. So 4-1, thank you. All right, now moving on to the treasure, the budget, and I want to thank Commissioner Skinner for your work on the budget, and the discussion that we just had was a reflection of a lot of work that you did, Commissioner Skinner, and I want to note that both in your role as commissioner and your role as treasurer. So thank you, and then to Grace, thank you for the comprehensive memo, and Eric and John for your work. So in terms of, we didn't always do a discussion like this, right, Derek? And so it really does present a good transparency for the public, but also a real understanding for us as to how our expenses are are taken care of. So thank you to the treasurer. All right. With respect to the budget overall, do I have a motion?
Madam Chair, I move that the commission approve the FY24 Commissioner's budget as included in the Commissioner's packet and discussed here today.
And Commissioner Skinner did weigh in at the same time, Commissioner Hill?
Oh,
Fine.
no,
No worries. I'll second your motion.
don't second my emotion. You should be doing this with all your hard work that you did. So
Please.
go ahead.
You know, he withdrew his motion. Commissioner Skinner, would you like to move?
Oh, boy, we spent an hour on travel discussion.
Yeah, but it's worth it. It's good. It's all good.
I move that the commission approve the FY24 Commissioner's budget as included in the Commissioner's packet and discussed here today.
Second.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Commissioner O'Brien,
Aye.
Commissioner Hill,
Aye.
Commissioner Skinner,
Aye.
Commissioner Maynard,
Aye.
and I vote yes. Thank you for the excellent work. John, great to see you. Okay. Let me just get my. We turn now to a second commissioner matter. There are times where, because we are 5 individual commissioners, but work and decide as a majority, we need to go over matters. And Commissioner O'Brien, you're taking the lead on this issue.
Yes, Madam Chair, this came up a year ago. It's been tabled because we were hoping to have it rolling with something, a broader discussion about our respective roles and the compliance working group in particular. You know, I'd been talking about getting a compliance committee of a much smaller group. Unfortunately, with Jacqueline's departure in sports wagering, that has not advanced. Statutorily, under 23K Section 3F, annually, we have to elect a treasurer and a secretary, and it is approaching that time of year again. Commissioner Skinner has been treasurer and Commissioner Hill has been secretary. So we have to decide the presumptive nominees in terms of going forward for the next term. One thing that has moved in the 5 years I've been here is the start of the term. So I do think that one of the things we should all have an agreement on is what's the best time of year to have this turnover, because it should be the least disruptive time, obviously for staff, and also be mindful of when our terms end, because we've had a couple circumstances where terms end, maybe seats are vacant, there's some scrambling to fill some of these seats. So my thought was that it's better to have a presumptive progression and succession of who's going to cycle in and out of these rather than be caught scrambling, trying to figure out who's going to go in to seats next. I'm assuming, given the timing of the budget, but if Derek is still on, you know, I'd love to hear his thoughts on whether July 1 does make sense or whether it should be a little later than that in terms of the terms turning over, because if you're changing a treasurer who's been working on the budget, I want to make sure we're doing that at a time that's the least disruptive. I throw out July 1, but again, if staff has a different thought on that, I'd like to hear it. I would like us to stay away from springtime again because of our terms ending in March, April. I think having a term end March, April, May is a little, I think the risk of disruption is a little bit greater if we do it there. So Derek, I saw you on your video came back. I don't know if you had thoughts on the timing of that.
The timing of it is never ideal, especially when you're dealing with the treasurer and state finances. They're not generally like private or regular accounting. You know, you've got the encumbrance issues, you've got fund accounting versus regular debits and credits. So, you know, I understand what you're saying. Keep it away from that April, March timeline when someone's term may be ending, because then you're right in the middle of a fiscal year. July, you're opening up a second fiscal year and closing out one. So you'll still have bills from the prior period that are coming in through August, July and August. So there's really no good time. Stay away from the March, April would probably be the best. That's an awful time. And you know, the budget cycle is closed come July, so that may be helpful because you don't have to jump headfirst into a brand new budget cycle as well and meeting with the licensees. But it's never a good time, right? It's a highly specialized function. You have to learn about Chapter 29 state finance law. You have to learn about all our policies and procedures internally. So that's the one reason I've always said the treasurer, I wouldn't recommend turning over every year. It may be better to have a longer cycle. Every year you've got someone new learning the ropes. Not if they have a lot of experience with state finances, then they just learn our policies, but it's a lot for a 1-year time period.
Right. So it sounds like in terms of cycles and timing, if we were going to memorialize that either a July 1 or July 15 or something would fit in sort of staying away from the end of term. The length of terms, I mean, we have to elect annually. I think statutorily the presumption would be the term is a year. Separate conversation we can have on whether we want these to flip every year, whether we want it to be every 2 years. You still have to have the election every year, whether we're saying people, stay for 2 years or not. In terms of rotating the 4 of us through who are sort of up potentially for secretary and treasurer, the 2 thoughts that I had, again, I was envisioning this at one point, cycling through with, maybe participation in the compliance committee, that sort of thing, but that is not in a posture to be discussed today. Would either be to simply cycle everyone through in a descending order by designating each seat and saying this is how they go through, or cycling 2 out who've been in with the 2 who have not been doing either of these, and you simply go into the seat that you hadn't done the last time that you were in there. If that were to be followed, Commissioner Skinner and Commissioner Hill would cycle out, Commissioner Maynard and I would cycle in. I would go into treasurer, Commissioner Maynard would go to secretary. Another way that a lot of institutions do it would be the secretary goes into treasurer would cycle up to something or out. That would mean Commissioner Hill would become treasurer and Commissioner Maynard would become secretary. And then myself and Commissioner Skinner would be in the queue to then cycle back through. So the things to really, I didn't write anything up because I think I'll have to come to a consensus how we think is best to do this to avoid confusion and gaps in fulfilling the vote and the statutory obligation on these 2 seats. Is when do we want the terms to kick off? And do we want to have which sort of choice do we want in terms of presumptive nominees, so that there's no surprises or confusion in terms of the presumptive movement in terms of how we're going to fulfill these.
Commissioners? Well, we've got to think about this.
It's a riveting conversation.
Statutory. So it is an annual. Do you propose that perhaps it could be 2-year terms? Gave it, various scenarios. We're all in this together. Commissioners?
Let me just share I agree with the concept of having people get into these positions, learn about the positions. I said this last year, and I still feel the same way. We're overseeing the entire agency. We are commissioners of the entire Mass Gaming Commission. And I, for one, loved being the secretary. I've learned a lot in this position, as I think I would learn a lot if I was a treasurer. And certainly the subcommittees that I have been on, I've learned more about gaming and sports wagering than I ever thought I would ever learn. And it is something that I have truly appreciated. I think being able to be in these different positions is beneficial to all of us, to be able to learn each division by being put in positions to learn. So concept-wise, Madam Chair, I like the notion of being able to take a vote every year and being able to be voted into different positions. When I was a local officials, we did it yearly. You voted for a chair, you voted for a vice chair, you voted for secretary, and we all took turns. in those different positions to learn the responsibilities of each one. So concept-wise, I like what Commissioner O'Brien is proposing. The discussion is going to be, how do we get there? I heard what Derek said about the 2 years and 1 year. I feel comfortably saying I think a year term is fine. I don't think they need to be 2-year terms. I think we're all smart enough and knowledgeable enough about state government that I would not need, a whole year to learn about spending in state government. That's me personally. So concept-wise, I agree with what Commissioner O'Brien's proposing. How we get there certainly is a discussion that I look forward to. And I would say that a year is fine as a term, not necessarily 2 years.
Commissioner O'Brien, are you leaning in now, or can I turn to Commissioner
No.
Skinner? Commissioner Skinner, Commissioner Maynard?
Yeah, I like Commissioner Hill. The concept makes sense to me. I'm okay with that. I mean, again, I'm going to go back to, change is good, and I think this commission has demonstrated that they value change, just in terms of the policies, just going back to the travel policy and the sort of the restrictions and limitations placed on that. So, I'm fine with that. I know that historically the treasurer's appointee has served as treasurer. That being said, I'm just looking at the statutory language. That is certainly not a requirement. So conceptually, I'm fine with it. To use Commissioner Hill's phrase, how we get there is a different issue. I'm glad to see, however, that, I remember this discussion when it first came up last year. I think Commissioner O'Brien, I can't remember, so I'm not going to attribute it to you, but I think someone suggested that if you were a newer commissioner that you could not serve as an officer, which I disagreed with then. And I also disagree with that now. It was something that was tossed around. I don't remember who, and who raised that as a potential limitation, but it certainly got raised. So I'm glad we're off of that, and that's not something that's being proposed today. So we can talk about how we cycle commissioners in and out of those roles.
Commissioner O'Brien?
No, I certainly never suggested anyone had to wait. To the contrary, very often the junior person is put in as secretary in a lot of organizations. When I was looking around at sort of, officer succession, the idea being you get to know sort of the nitty gritty of the meetings and stuff, but no one ever suggested that you needed to be here for some period of time prior to assuming either of these. Historically, there was the same person being secretary and the same person being treasurer when I first got here. I did the same thing Commissioner Skinner did. I looked that up. I assumed the first time I voted and they were saying it was statutory based on their seat. It's not. And my time in the IG's office, see bells and whistles go off. It's never a good idea to have just one person staying there. That sort of sends red flags off in terms of best practices. So whether it be 1 year or 2 years, the better thing is to rotate everybody through. So I don't have a preference for the options. I'm happy to hear from everybody. Commissioner Maynard, I know, hasn't had the chance to talk in terms of what makes the most sense logically and expeditiously, or if someone else has another idea in terms of just how we default to who's going to be nominated. People may have reasons for declining, I don't know, but that way, when you get to an open meeting, there's sort of the presumption of this is how this is going to cycle forward.
Commissioner Maynard?
Thank you, Madam Chair. As the newest commissioner, I'm happy to hear there's not a presumption that the newest commissioner can't perform a function that his or her appointing authorities think that they can perform, or they wouldn't have appointed them in the first place. So that's, I guess I would take that issue off the table.
That's the same point I made not to interrupt you, but I made that exact point last year when it got suggested.
I
Yeah.
do want to clarify something, that it's not, that may be one commissioner's memory, that's not exactly my memory. And I just want to be careful.
Either.
I think there were a couple of people who were interested in a position, and there might have been the idea that allowing somebody who had been here longer to allow them to go first. I think it was just about that. It wasn't about somebody not being eligible. Because certainly I know that I did not say that, and I know I would never have endorsed that idea. So
I don't remember who said it, but what I will say is, when we talked about travel and the allocation of the 20%, commissioners were certain that that was the consensus last year, and it was not. So I respect the fact that you're saying that you don't remember, but it definitely was the case where I can't remember who, but a commissioner suggested that a new commissioner could not serve as an officer. I remember that very distinctly, just as I remember the travel discussion from a year ago, very distinctly. Commissioner Maynard, please.
I oftentimes, I remember how I feel, even if I don't remember exactly what's said. So I appreciate your sentiment. I think that, yeah, I served in a dual control role in payroll in the governor's office. I hear what Commissioner O'Brien's saying, and I agree with her wholeheartedly that there should be turnover, that there should be multiple sets of eyes on any matter. How we decide to do it, whether it's to vacate the current positions and then allow musical chairs, for a lack of a better term, or to have step ups and step outs. I'm pretty open to that, and it's not something I'm going to lose sleep over tonight. But I will say that I do think that there should be turnover. That turnover is good. New sets of eyes are good, and I waited on purpose till the end because I wanted to hear what the treasurer and what the secretary had to say about their respective roles and their past year working on them. So as to the timing, I understand there's no real perfect time, given that we typically have spring appointment dates for commissioners and a July 1st fiscal date, but whatever works best. So I think that in short, I agree with the sentiment of Commissioner O'Brien.
So commissioners, what do you want to do for next step? Commissioner O'Brien?
Oh, I said I didn't know if you had thoughts on it. I mean, it seems like the July 1 date might make sense in terms of staying away from all of our appointment and end of term. I know that's not imminent for anybody of the four of us, but in the future, then it stays away from that time of year. So then it's really a question of, do we want to go presumptive, where secretary goes up to treasurer, treasurer cycles out, whoever hasn't been secretary can cycle in, or do we want to do flipping out in and out, where the two that have not done it then cycle in to whichever one they haven't done before? I don't have a preference for either one. If people want to think about it, and we can go back and figure out how we want to do this, maybe at the next date. I think we have about 6 weeks before we need to, turn these over.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
just a process question. So we vote on these, and I believe that is done by Mass General Law, correct?
Yeah. It's 23K, 3F.
Yes, so with that said, we can't really decide to recycle because we're going to have to make votes.
What do you mean to recycle?
If we're asking to put forth the proposal you put forth, where 2 people step down, 2 more people get put in, we're still voting for that to happen.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's not changing the vote. It's more the confusion that's happened in the past when somebody either leaves their term early or we don't get an appointment in. We've had that happen, is you scramble and go, we don't have a secretary. We're not going to have a treasurer. We have to get somebody in there. And we can't talk to each other absent a public meeting, right? So there have been voids. So really this conversation came up after that. amongst Commissioner Cameron and the chair and myself in terms of like, there should just be, I think a lot of institutions call it the presumptive nominee. So that it's sort of like, yep, everybody knows this is probably who's going to be nominated for these respective seats. Doesn't mean there might be circumstances. Maybe somebody knows they're going to be on leave or something and they say, you know what, it's just not a good year for me to do this. You know, so then they're not the person, but at least there's no confusion, right? Of saying, okay, the presumptive nominees are going to be this for the respective seats when we get to the next meeting.
So Madam Chair, and through you to Commissioner O'Brien, the term presumptive nominee is something I had not heard before, and that answers my question.
My question is, what does the nomination process look like?
It's in the public meeting. And so you would sit there and say, I nominate, Commissioner Maynard to be treasurer. Someone would second it and then off you would go. And sometimes people don't want to do it. Maybe they have some, and so but we couldn't talk to each other in advance. And so it was always, maybe one person would say, would you mind if I nominate you to do X? But they can only talk to each other. They can't talk to anybody else. And so it just led to a lot of confusion at the public meetings in terms of the nomination process. So to me, this was just one of the ways to avoid all of that. And even what happened last year with confusion in terms of expectations on who was going to be where, because it can only be nominated in a public meeting, not by any individual commissioner. So, and then it actually gets voiced and voted on in the public meeting.
I think in a couple of your scenarios, you had put the secretary going directly into the treasurer role.
Presumptive nominee, meaning the presumption would be, so a lot of entities will do this. You go secretary, treasurer, vice chair, chair. Okay. And the presumption is when the slate comes up, if you were secretary, the presumption is you would be the nominee for treasurer. Now that can always be up for, someone else throws their hat in the ring or someone declines because they have whatever reason. But a lot of entities function that way that have boards and commissions where you're just the presumptive person who's going to be nominated, but nothing happens unless and until you're actually nominated and voted on in the public meeting.
So the idea would be accession. It would be, that.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
I know it's boring and it's tedious, but I've been here for several of these vacating and all of us being caught flat-footed without an officer and not being able to talk about it till we get in the meeting. So.
Commissioner O'Brien, do you have a motion in mind for today?
I don't. What I thought might be better is if there is a consensus, I was going to write something up really short and sweet in terms of process that we could all then vote on and say, yep, this is just how we're going to default on this in terms of timing of the term and, order of succession of nominations, presumptive nominations.
So it's a timing of the vote. Is it also term and then the third point, and you'd write it up and bring it forward at a future meeting?
Right. And we could even say the anticipation is the vote would be held, 2 weeks prior to the meeting before July 1st, you would vote, et cetera, because there was a year or two when we, were a little late in getting to this procedurally because it wasn't really on the books. So if it's something that can be recurring on the calendar, that, the vote's here and the term starts here and it's sort of, ministerial at that point.
Yeah, and that's particularly important because invoices need to be paid and they cannot do so. They cannot be paid unless the treasurer signs off on it.
Right, exactly. So when Commissioner Zuniga left, we had to scramble to get a meeting to get Commissioner Cameron named so that we could, they wouldn't be without that function. So if there is a presumption that you leave.
We were three.
Yeah, we had three. That was the other thing I did want to bring up is, so there would be this presumption, but there should be a catch-all that if for some reason we were a body of less than 5, you would just go to, whoever was not in that seat last.
Right. because we
I
were
was gonna
down
put
to-
something like that in there so that if you're down to 3 or 4, the presumptive nominee has now, timed out or taken another job. That it's just, okay, then you just go to the next person on the list.
Right, we were 3, and Commissioner O'Brien, you were serving as really an interim secretary because you took over for
Right.
Commissioner Stebbins.
Yeah.
And we were faced with the invoice issue that Commissioner Skinner just faced.
Right.
So, and so formalizing this process is a great idea. Commissioner O'Brien, it sounds like you're looking for some more thoughts from the others.
Is there a preference? I guess, is there a preference? It seems like we all agree in principle to most of it and timing. Is there a preference for simply, naming who cycles in, secretary up to treasurer, then out, et cetera, or alternating the 2 that are in, presumptively the 2 that were out become nominees? And if not, I can write up both and we can decide when I bring back the policy itself on version A or version B.
I don't think I like the 2 moving out, 2 moving in. I think I like
You
the
like this
succession.
going up and out? Okay.
Yes,
So I'll draft it that way then.
that's my preference. I don't know about anybody
Yeah.
else.
Commissioner Maine and Commissioner Skinner.
I'm okay with that. I'm also thinking there's an option where theoretically, as long as the 2 people who are vacating their seats, that they could potentially just switch and go to the other if they really wanted to.
Oh, I
I
see
don't
what you
know
mean.
if they wanted to, but once the seats were vacant, if the treasurer wanted to run for secretary, I would be okay with a method like that too, as long as it's vacant, the opportunity is given, and we have to vote anyways, as Commissioner Hill pointed out, but people can stand for whatever or be nominated for whatever office they've not held.
I agree with
Commissioner
that.
Skinner.
I like that approach. I just don't want to preclude anyone from seeking out a role just based on, the presumptive nominee concept. Or
I mean, I
the
can
2
certainly-
cycling in, or the 2 cycling out and 2 cycling in.
Yeah. So part of this is, though, to the better practice is cycling people out of the one they were in.
Oh,
And so
yeah.
they're not, the idea is not staying in the one that you were in the year before. And making sure we all sort of stay fresh in it in terms of cycling through. So if you've been in them, the presumption would be if you were in for the last 2, you wouldn't be in, you would be in some other function of the commission. And Commissioner Hill and I had this conversation lately too, of really looking at what are the other functions to make sure we all get into CMF and everything else, that we're all participating in all of that. But there's nothing that stops someone obviously from raising their hand. As Commissioner Maynard said, I want to go back and be secretary again or treasurer again.
And I think that would be helpful just to get sort of an understanding of where we all stand in terms of desires. We kind of had this discussion a little bit last year, but it would just be helpful to have everybody on the same page so that we can understand who's interested in what and then go from there.
Mhm.
And then I know Commissioner O'Brien, I thought that you were going to be introducing a new office around compliance. Is that?
I started the conversation with that because that was supposed to be happening. Jack Flynn was brought in. He was going to help us with compliance. We were going to be talking about a smaller compliance committee. Jack Flynn left right as sports wagering took off. And so there hasn't been the traction and the solidification of that. That was going to be part of this broader conversation. This one is coming now because we have to have the election in the next month or so, just by the timing of the statutory annual requirement. But there is a broader conversation to have too about what other options are out there for us as commissioners in terms of committees and subcommittees and that sort of thing.
Compliance committee and other subcommittees, I would say we would really need to turn to legal.
Right.
On that, because there are implications.
The open meeting law and also HR, because there are certain areas in their purview, but we'd also want to create the committee that allows for communication to someone not in the direct line of authority of whoever it is that you're talking about.
Right. We really, this has never been really fleshed out. Commissioner O'Brien, you may be having individual conversations with members of the staff, but certainly this has never been fleshed out with,
No.
with me, and I don't know, with whom.
So to be clear, Madam Chair, they did in advance. I had preliminary conversations with Jack Flynn about this, and then he was gathering other government entities in terms of how the best practices are, and then he left.
Right.
So, and then sports wagering hit. And so this is not advanced beyond sort of that preliminary conversation on let's get best practices and then have a conversation about it.
Okay, so for next steps on the matter that's before us.
So I'm going to draft up a policy statement in terms of this, just the officers and the presumptive nomination and succession, consistent with the conversation, which appears to be cycling through 1-year terms effective July 1, with the vote at least 2 weeks prior to that July 1 date. And then we can all take a look at it and make sure it covers what we were thinking of. So this can be more ministerial and hopefully avoid any sort of confusion or scrambling if we have people leaving.
Commissioner Skinner, are you weighing in on that?
No, I think that sounds appropriate as a next step. But at what point will we learn of others' interests?
So I think what it is there is a presumptive nominee, and then
For
to the
a
extent
treasurer.
that for so the presumption going forward, if we're cycling through, would be that Commissioner Hill would be the presumptive nominee for treasurer, Commissioner Maynard would be the presumptive nominee for secretary. And then that would be marked up for the vote, knowing that those are the presumptive nominees and that we were going to talk about it that day. And that if somebody else wants to throw their hat in the ring, and they're welcome to do that.
And just for clarity's sake, why is Commissioner Maynard the presumptive nominee for secretary? Because he hasn't held.
He has not held an officer's position yet.
Okay.
But Commissioner Skinner, to your point, I think you're trying to say that there might be an opportunity for, and it's not just with the commission in front of us now, this is a process, right? So we just, you're saying that there, just because somebody might be rolling off a position or not in a position, Commissioner O'Brien is also not in a position. Should there be a mechanism to be able to trigger, I'm also interested, isn't that?
Yeah.
And that's my point, because I am also interested in the office of secretary. But I understand that, it is important for each of us to get the experience and interaction in other roles and offices. So I'm okay with what's being proposed, but I would like there to at least be the opportunity for commissioners, to raise interest. Commissioner O'Brien, I know last year you were interested in treasurer. I think you should have the opportunity to say, this year I am interested in the treasurer position. I don't think we should be excluded from that in whatever it is you're drafting up.
Yeah, no, it's not foreclosing anything. It is literally, doing this so there is a default process with the catch-all, again, if we're less than 5, because I have been here when we have scrambled without a secretary or a treasurer, because we can't do that until we hit a public meeting. So if someone leaves unexpectedly and there is not a public meeting scheduled, we are without an officer. So this would presumptively cycle in somebody presumptively to that position. That's the only reason I'm doing this. But it doesn't stop anybody from raising their hand when we get to that meeting for the vote to say they're interested.
Could we maybe have some options?
Yeah. In terms of cycling in and out, you mean?
Yeah, an option and include and have it reflect Commissioner Skinner's good point that the succession plan may not always work, one.
Yep.
for somebody because of whatever reason. And then two, perhaps the commission feels that the succession plan just isn't best at that time for the commission or the Commonwealth.
Mhm.
And if somebody else is interested and there may be a yielding to the,
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, these are all, that's why I kept using the word presumptive. These aren't, this vote in this memo is not going to be, this is how we're going to do it. These are the presumptive nominees, so we don't have this void and we don't have this confusion. And then mark it up for the hearing and have the conversation at the public meeting.
Commissioners, how do you feel?
Oh, sorry.
No, go right ahead. Go,
Madam
go.
Chair,
No,
just,
no, no.
just again, so these presumptive nominees would slide into those roles. And then
No.
there would,
No, they are the presumptive nominee in
they
terms
needed
of
to be
succession.
voted in.
Yes,
Okay,
but we had circumstances in the past, when I was secretary, we had a vacancy in treasurer. I would have loved to have gone from secretary to treasurer, but I was never, all of a sudden I get to a meeting and it's like, oh, we're going to do treasurer. It's to avoid any sort of expectations other than what's in the public meeting. And so I think the best way to do that is there's just a ministerial default presumption of the nomination goes on for the meeting, and anybody is free to say, I don't want to do it, or I want to do it.
Commissioner O'Brien, what I'm really hearing here is really a general person's agreement on how this should run. And, I think about every election in the country from, the lowest to the highest. There's always rules of engagement, right, to get to the election. I hear you saying you're wanting the fidelity to the statutory requirements of having to take the vote, but at the same time having the general person's agreement on where we start the conversation. And I actually, I really appreciate that.
I appreciate that as well. But I think I'm still, we'll wait for the memo and further discussion, but what I'm struggling with is it removes any discretion altogether.
It doesn't remove discretion, it creates a presumption. That's it. It doesn't remove discretion, but it also stops anyone from having misconceptions based on one commissioner saying something that they are going to be the next officer in that role unless and until there's a public discussion and a vote, which has happened in the 5 years I've been here. It's happened a couple of times.
Yeah, I mean, well, to your point, the discretion is in the vote, right? So, I get that, but in terms of the nominees, there's no discretion, essentially.
Not the presumptive, correct. There would not be in the presumptive. And part of that is best practices in terms of it is better to cycle people through than have them stay. So in that regard, it's also, I think, aligning with better practices of cycling us in and out of these seats.
Yeah, well, you have the benefit of that best practice, and so I'm wondering if there's material or some information that we could get, to help me along. And if you point me in the right direction, I'll go find it myself. I just want to understand this best practice just a little bit more.
I'm sure maybe Derek can help me out and I'll find my IG stuff, but traditionally you like to have sort of separation in terms of authority, and you like to not have one person, particularly when it comes to things like being the keeper of the record or the treasurer of an organization, being the same person year in, year out, because you want other eyes to come in and be able to look at it. And it's not impugning anybody at all. It's just, I can tell you from my financial investigations background, one of the things that would raise an eyebrow is to have the same person in one position of authority in an institution, be it signing off on timesheets or signing off on checks or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I'd love an educational opportunity. So that's all what this is. I'd love to, come up to speed on best practices. Thank you.
Derek, I didn't know if you were back on video, whether you had anything.
I was here in case there are any questions to that discussion, just because you asked. You said if I was still there.
Okay, so do we agree then we'll have Grace take note, and we'll put this item on another public meeting sufficiently in advance of kind of a July one? vote, the annual vote. We know we have to do that. How and who, we're still deciding, and we'll look for the guidance of the memo, and that will come through one of our perhaps later May meetings or early June meetings. Does that work, commissioners?
Yep, works for me.
Okay, and it can be, of course, distributed in advance. We just can't talk among
We
ourselves.
can talk about it till we get here. Yep.
So this is definitely an internal discussion, but an important one for our own governance, and appreciate it. Thank you, Commissioner O'Brien, for taking the lead. All right. All set, commissioners, am I right? Anything further on that? I'm not seeing any no's. Not seeing any yeses either, but.
I'm ready to move on.
Thanks. Appreciate it, Commissioner O'Brien and Commissioner Skinner. All right, so we have next, and we anticipate an executive session on a public safety update. Really, an opportunity for us to be updated on matters that generally with respect to public safety, but it is 1:09. We ran a little long on that. Grace, do we have members of that were expected to be part of that presentation who have a sharp deadline? Because commissioners, am I right that you might want to take a lunch, or do you want to go right into the executive session? And I'm not sure about people's schedules today.
So I did just shoot an email over to the folks who are presenting in that executive session. But I would welcome anyone's comments here if you do have any hard stops this afternoon. And I did check in with Trudy, Commissioner O'Brien. I'm not sure if you have a hard stop today.
I do. I was going to be in town, and because I stayed here to have a later hard stop, but about 2:20, I'm going to have to jump off for totally.
Okay.
So if we're not gone by 2:20, you lose me.
And we have, I know, a meeting that we need to do with respect to an adjudicatory function. Todd, I'll turn to you. Do you have, if we went into our executive session, could we add that at the end of, is your team ready if we go a little bit later than 1:30? I'm sorry, I'm not being terribly articulate there, am I?
Oh, I understand your question exactly. Yeah, I think that should be okay. We'll have to reschedule some other things, but.
Okay, so commissioners, hearing that we've got like an hour or so, I think it was good for us to go ahead with it if we vote for the executive session and go into that. I also know we probably need a quick bite. If we go into executive session, are we comfortable eating and making a working lunch?
Yep.
I'm okay. Does that make sense? I'm a
Yes.
huge fan of working lunches. I try to use the napkin a whole lot, but Commissioner Skinner, others nodded. Are you okay with that?
I'm okay with it. Yeah.
Commissioner Skinner, you look so nice. I thought maybe you were frozen.
No.
I was like, oh, she, okay, good. So why don't we decide, as you know, in order to go into executive session, I do have to read language from the statute. And the commission anticipates that it will meet in executive session in accordance with general laws, chapter 38, section 21A4, to discuss the deployment of security personnel or devices or strategies with respect thereto at the gaming establishments. The public session of the commission meeting will not reconvene at the conclusion of the executive session. We will be able to, unless there's some commissioner business that has not been addressed, we would conclude. Okay, so with that said, we would conclude this public session if we vote to move into the executive session. Commissioners, do I have a motion?
Madam Chair, I move that we go into executive session on the matter for the reasons just stated by the chair.
Okay, all those in favor. Commissioner O'Brien,
Aye.
Commissioner Hill,
Aye.
Commissioner Skinner,
Aye.
Commissioner Maynard,
All right.
and And I vote yes. So 5-0. We will now, we don't have to adjourn. We're going to go into executive session. This public meeting is now coming to a conclusion. Commissioners, we'll have you grab a quick lunch and as quickly as you can, get back to the new link that's on our calendar. Thank you so much, and thank you to the entire team for your patience today and your good work. And oh, Commissioner Skinner.
All right, well, I'm sorry, what does that mean, as quickly as you can? Are we,
Okay.
is it 1:30? I mean,
Sure. 1:30? I know we've got a few people in the office. Is that going to work? Okay. Thank you. And we'll eat it's 1:30 going to work for you, Commissioner O'Brien, okay?
Yeah.
Okay. All righty, 1:30. Thank you, Commissioner Skinner, and thank you to everybody.